Good evening, everyone. A warm welcome to all of you present here, our esteemed speaker, our respected dignitaries, learned professionals, legal researchers, students, and all of you. Thank you for joining. On behalf of Law Jurist, I, Ananya Tiwari, consider it my privilege and honor to extend a welcome to each one of you present today. Today's webinar is titled Understanding Anti-Money Laundering Laws from Enforcement Actions to Courtroom Advocacy. In today's fast paced regulatory landscape, anti money laundering laws have become one of the most critical and high stakes domain of corporate practice. With the rise of enforcement actions and courtroom proceedings globally, the session aims to provide practical and real world insights into the evolving legal framework and advocacy strategies. We are especially delighted to welcome our international participants joining us from various countries across the globe. Your presence too truly enriches this forum with diverse perspectives. Before we begin, allow me briefly to introduce our host, Law Jurist. Founded under the visionary leadership of Mr. Ayush Gaurav, it is a legal ethic and AI tech company committed to bridging the gap between the legal education and practical exposure. Through structured internships, student editor opportunities, and a comprehensive legal knowledge repository, Law Jurist continues to empower aspiring legal professionals across the country. Ladies and gentlemen, it is with immense honor and profound respect that we welcome our distinguished keynote speaker for this evening, Ms. Shachi Kothari, advocate and solicitor at Supreme Court of India. Ms. Kothari commands a formidable independent practice under the banner of Chambers of Shachi Kothari in New Delhi, appearing regularly before the Supreme Court of India, various high courts, national company law tribunals, and specialized commissions. Her practice focuses heavily on complex dispute resolution, spanning white-collar criminal defense under PMLA, FEMA frameworks, and commerce litigation, domestic as well as international arbitration. She regularly advises corporate groups and Fortune 500 entities across diverse sectors, handling strategic pre-litigation negotiation through to full courtroom representation. Her exceptional portfolio includes high-profile representations such as defending corporate and political leaders in massive anti-money laundering and mining scam investigations, handling multi-billion rupee insolvency proceedings up to rupees 140 billion 140 rupees before the NCLT, advising major global brands like Bar Association, holds a professional membership with leading global arbitral bodies including Singapore International Arbitration, LCIA, and AAA. We are incredibly privileged to learn from her rich frontline experience today. Few housekeeping rules that I would like to convey before we start the session. Before ma'am begins, a quick note to our participants. Please maintain decorum throughout the session. We will have a dedicated question and answer session towards the session, so please drop your questions into the chat box at any point. Additionally, the feedback and attendance form will be shared in the chat box towards the end of the session, which is mandatory to receive your participation certificates. Without further ado, I welcome Ms. Shashi Kothari to take over the session.
Please. Hi guys, thank you Ananya for that wonderful introduction. Not sure from where all you gathered the information regarding my matters. I was slightly creeped out for the lack of better word, but thanks a lot for your thorough research. Hi guys, good evening. This is Shachi Kothari. It's a pleasure to be here today with you all. So before I begin, let me ask you all a very simple question. I won't take too much of your time. I'll dive in straight to the session. All right. When you hear the term money laundering, what is the first thing that comes to your mind? I don't want this to be like a teacher student lecture or a lawyer law student lecture. I want it to be as interactive as one can get, right? So whoever has the answer from the audience, please feel free to unmute yourself and just give me an answer. When you hear the term money laundering, what is the first thing that comes to your mind? Anyone, any volunteer, please feel free. Okay, illegal process of taking large amounts. Mohammed. Dharvi, conversion of black money into white. All right, yeah. So most people or ask me illegal transfer of money. Hmm. Okay, so most people immediately think of black money, tax evasion, or perhaps someone converting cash into white money. Some might even think of suitcases, full of currency or dramatic scenes from films involving Hawala operators and shell companies. So those answers are understandable, guys, as you rightly pointed out. But they're also, the reason why the Prevention of Money Laundering Act is one of the most misunderstood legislations in our legal system. If there is one thing that money laundering and cyber fraud accounts and also flat converting dirty money into clean money, Siddhant Poda, yes. So that is the crux of it. So if there's any one thing I want all of you to take away from today's session, it's this. PMLA is not a law against black money, first of all. It's a law against the laundering of proceeds generated from a criminal activity. So that distinction may appear subtle, but it fundamentally changes the way we understand the act. So throughout this lecture, I'm not going to ask you to memorize sections or judgments. Instead, I want you to understand the philosophy behind the legislation. And once you understand the philosophy, the provisions of the act become logical rather than mechanical. So, as lawyers, we often have the tendency to begin with the bare acts. We open section 3, underline a few important words, memorize the definitions under section 2, and then move on to bail under section 45, because that is usually what everyone is interested in. I'd request you to resist that temptation for the next hour or so, because let's first understand the problem that Parliament was trying to solve. Only then will the provisions of the statutes begin to make sense to you. So let me put it differently now. Imagine you're a doctor. A patient comes to you with a fever. If you immediately prescribe medication without identifying the underlying symptoms or the infection, you may suppress the symptoms without curing the disease, right? Similarly, if we jump straight into sections 3, 5, 19, or 45 of the PMLA without understanding why the act exists in the first place, we are merely treating symptoms. To truly appreciate the legislation, we must first understand the disease it seeks to cure. Now, let me ask another question. I'm so sorry I keep asking questions, but that's my job as a lawyer. Suppose a person commits a bank fraud worth rupees 500 crore. He cheats a consortium of banks by submitting forged financial statements and fabricated stock reports. The police or the CBI case is registered against him for cheating, forgery, and let's say criminal conspiracy. So at this point, he has the law not already taken care of the wrongdoing? Because after all, cheating is punishable under the BNS or the penal code. Forgery is punishable. Criminal conspiracy is punishable. If all of these legislations or the offenses are already existing, why did the parliament feel the need to enact an entirely separate legislation called the Prevention of Money Laundering Act? The answer lies in understanding that governments across the world gradually realize that's something very, important. That criminals do not commit offenses merely for the thrill of breaking laws. In most cases, they commit offenses because those offenses generate wealth, whether it is corruption, narcotics trafficking, organized crime, cyber fraud, GST fraud, bank fraud, or illegal mining. The ultimate objective is always and always economic gain, and therefore the state merely punishes the offender but allows him to retain the wealth generated from the offense, and the crime remains profitable. In many cases, the offender may even consider imprisonment to be an acceptable business risk if the financial benefits remain untouched. So, modern anti money laundering laws are based upon a very different philosophy. They seek to ensure that crime does not pay. The objective is not merely to prosecute the offender, but to ensure the identification, trace, freeze, attachment, and ultimately confiscation the wealth that has been generated from the criminal activity. In simple terms, the law attempts to deprive the criminal not only of his liberty, but also the economic incentive behind the crime. So, this brings us to a very interesting observation. Traditional criminal law focuses primarily on the offender. PMLA, on the other hand, focuses equally on the property. That is why you will often hear experienced lawyers say that that in a PMLA investigation, you should always follow the money rather than the person. The movement of money often reveals far more than the statements of witnesses. So, to understand this better, let us consider a practical example. Imagine a businessman who fraudulently obtains 300 crores from a bank by creating fictitious invoices and inflating value of his inventory, like we just did. The moment the loan amount is credited into his account, he does not simply keep the money lying there. Instead, he begins moving it around. Some amount is transferred to another company owned by a relative. A portion is invested into a luxury real estate, let's say in Dubai. Another part is routed through multiple shell companies. Some funds are sent abroad in guise of consultancy fees. Expensive artwork is purchased. Shares are acquired through different entities. And 5 years later, if someone examines his balance sheet, everything appears perfectly legitimate. The original criminal activity has disappeared beneath layers of apparently lawful transactions. Right? Now, let me ask all of you another question. Has the original bank fraud disappeared? Anybody, whoever understands the lecture so far, please feel free to answer. At this point in time, has the original bank fraud disappeared? I'll wait. Correct, correct. Of course not. The fraud remains the original offense, but something new has also now happened. The person has attempted to disconnect the money from its criminal origin and present it as legitimate wealth. And that subsequent process is what law describes as money laundering. Notice the distinction carefully because it forms the foundation of the entire act. The bank fraud is one offense. The process of disguising and legitimizing wealth generated from the fraud is another offense. They are connected, but they are not identical. In fact, one of the biggest mistakes made by young lawyers is, and what I did the same thing, is that treating the scheduled offense and the offense of money laundering as though they are the same. They are not. They involve different investigations, different statutory requirements, and often, different agencies. So by the end of today's lecture, I don't want you to remember, 20 sections. I want you to leave with answers to just three broad questions, which would help you understand the basics of the PMLA entirely, right? These are three questions. Farhan, ma'am, this Farhan, I have doubt. Guys, I understand that you have doubts. So this session, if I'm not wrong, Ananya, I think is being recorded. And people who have missed out on any point may go back to the recording wherever it's uploaded. And as for the doubts, we'll have a dedicated Q&A round after, I believe, 55 minutes. And then we can have a one-on-one chit-chat about your questions. Thanks. Right? Anyway, so three questions, like I said. What exactly is money laundering? How does the Enforcement Directorate actually investigate? And why is bail so difficult under the PMLA? Right? These are the three broader questions I want you to understand and want you to have answer to at the end of this lecture. So I'll begin with first. What exactly is money laundering? Although I have already explained it to you already, but let's also use the section 3 usage under the act, which is the fundamental question. Before we discuss the law, we must understand the problem that the law is trying to solve, right? Imagine that the person commits a bank fraud. Again, too many bank frauds worth rupees hundreds here. The fraud itself is complete the moment the bank is dishonestly induced to part with its money. And that offense may amount to cheating under the BNS or IPC previously, forgery, criminal conspiracy, or offenses under the special statutes. The police or the CBI can investigate that offense and prosecute the accused. Now ask yourself what happens to 100 CR. I'm repeating it so that you guys understand it better. The more you hear it, the more you process it, the better you understand it and are able to relate afterwards. So does the accused keep it in the bank account, the money? Of course not. He transfers it into the different companies, luxury apartments, like I said, invests in shares, expensive luxuries, routes funds through shell companies, and perhaps send some money to abroad. And after a few years, the money no longer appears to have come from fraud, and it appears to be perfectly legitimate business. So that process of distinguishing the criminal origin of money is called money laundering. So the important point to understand is that the offense of money laundering is different from the offense that generated the money. The money that is being generated is a criminal activity. And any money that is being generated from a criminal activity and is a scheduled or is present in the schedules of the PMLA would be known as the scheduled offense or the proceeds of crime. Okay, okay. Sorry, I got distracted by the messages. Host, can you please turn off the messages? I'm sorry, guys. I get distracted easily. All right. So now, the important point to understand is that the offense of money laundering is different from the offense that generated the money, right? The bank fraud generated the criminal property. Money laundering is the process of making that criminal property appear legitimate. Now, think of it in this way. Imagine muddy water. You pour it through several filters until it appears crystal clear. The water is still the same, only its appearance has changed. Money laundering works exactly the same way. I'm repeating the example, I'm repeating the same concept with different examples so that you guys understand it thoroughly. The money never loses its criminal origin. The accused merely attempts to hide that origin. And this is why lawyers often say that PMLA is not a law against money, it's law against criminal property. The objective of the act is not to get hold of the offender, but to trace the money trail and get that money. Right? Now, if any of you is having Bear Act with you at the moment, you can turn to Section 3 of the Act. It defines the offense of money laundering, and it provides that any person who directly or indirectly attempts to indulge, knowingly assist, knowingly become a party, or is actually involved in any process or activity connected with the proceeds of crime, including its concealment, possession, acquisition, use, etc., commits the offense of money laundering. Now, notice something very different, interesting. Section 3 does not merely punish the person who committed the original crime, it punishes anyone who knowingly becomes involved with the proceeds of crime. For example, suppose a chartered accountant knowingly helps route fraud money through shell companies, and suppose a director knowingly assisted in purchasing property using criminal proceeds. Suppose someone knowingly accepts tainted money being the black money, and helps project it as legitimate business income. And each of these persons may potentially attract liability under Section 3 because Act targets participation in the laundering process as well. That is, if any of you have any doubts so far, please tell me. Hosts, can people unmute their mics during in between the session?
Ma'am, they can unmute themselves after you have done
Okay,
with your
okay.
presentation.
Take care.
Yeah.
I'm contradicting myself. I'm sorry, guys. So now, the other important facet of money laundering, guys, is that money laundering is a continuing offense. So this became much clearer after Parliament inserted the explanation to Section 3 in 2019. The explanation clarifies that every activity connected with the proceeds of crime, whether concealment, possession, acquisition, use, projection of untainted property, forms part of the continuing offense. This means that as long as a person continues to enjoy or deal with the proceeds of crime, the offense continues. It could be 1 year, 10 years, 100 years, 5 years, whatever. But the main point, or the but in the situation, is that Section 3 cannot be read in isolation. Before Section 3 can even apply, there must be proceeds of crime, what I was just talking. This expression is defined under Section 2U, that is definition of proceeds of crime. According to the definition, proceeds of crime means any property derived or obtained directly or indirectly by any person as a result of criminal activity relating to a scheduled offense. It also includes the value of such property and, in certain circumstances, the property located outside India. So now this definition is perhaps the most litigated provision of the Act, because every PMLA case ultimately revolves around one question: can the prosecution establish that this particular property is actually connected with a scheduled offense? If there is no proceeds of crime, there can ordinarily be no offense under Section 3. And that is why experienced uh, practitioners often begin every PMLA brief by asking only one question: whether there exists a scheduled offense. There are a couple of, I believe, three parts, part A, B, C, a couple of schedules under the PMLA scheme where offenses under BNS, narcotics, and other statutes, Company Act, are there. Not all the sections of other statutes, but a few provisions that would directly relate to economic offenses or a bigger threat to even national security. If those offenses are present in the scheduled offense, and ED says that you have committed those offense, and based on those offense you have generated wealth, and that is why you have committed an offense under money laundering or prevention of money laundering act, then the case would stand. But that like I said, as a lawyer, you always ask this first question: if there is a scheduled offense in whatever the ED is saying against me, if there is a scheduled against me, that there is a possibility that a money laundering offense has been committed. But until and unless that schedule is not there, then there is no case of money laundering. I wish I could go deep into this one particular question because there's so much more to it. But we all have time constraint today, all because of law jurors, or Ayush rather. Thanks. I wish it was a longer session, right? Okay. So now the second question is, how does ED actually investigate? ED is the investigating authority under the statute. Now that we understand that Parliament enacted the Act, the next obvious question is, how does the ED actually investigate a case? Every time we open a newspaper, we read headlines such as ED conducts searches at multiple locations, ED summons businessman, ED attaches properties worth 500 crore, 1 lakh 100 crores, or ED arrests former minister in money laundering cases, Arvind Kejriwal, for example. So these headlines often create an impression that the Enforcement Directorate is another police agency with wider powers. But in reality, that is not an accurate understanding. The ED is not a substitute for the police, nor does it investigate every crime committed in the country. Its jurisdiction is far more specialized. So to understand the role of ED, let's begin with a simple proposition. The ED is not primarily concerned with how the crime was committed. Like I said, it's concerned with what happened to the money generated from that crime. It's concerned with what happened. I'm sorry. I just checked my notes. Okay. So distinction may sound simple, but it defines the entire investigation. Imagine a government officer accepts illegal gratification for awarding public contract to a private company. The investigation into the act of bribery may be conducted by the Anti-Corruption Bureau or CBI under the Prevention of Corruption Act. They will investigate who demanded the bribe, who paid it, whether there was a demand and acceptance, and whether the ingredient of the offenses are made out. The ED enters the picture only after another question arises. Where did that money go? Was it deposited into bank accounts? Was it used to purchase an agricultural land? Was it invested in the names of family members? Was it transferred to a company controlled by someone else? Was it converted into gold, shares, cryptocurrency? The ED investigates the financial journey of the criminal proceeds and not merely the criminal act itself. I repeat, the ED investigates the financial journey of the criminal proceeds and not merely the criminal act itself. This is why every PMLA investigation begins with one indispensable requirement: a scheduled offense. You may remember from our earlier discussion that the schedule to the Act contains offenses under various statutes such as BNS, Prevention of Corruption Act, NDPS Act, Customs Act, Companies Act, and several other legislations. Unless there is a scheduled offense that has generated proceeds of crime, the question of money laundering ordinarily does not arise. In simple terms, the scheduled offense is the foundation. Again, guys, the scheduled offense is the foundation upon which the PMLA case is built. If there is no underlying criminal activity capable of generating proceeds of crime, the ED has nothing to investigate under this act. At this age, let me ask you a rhetorical question. Does the ED register an FIR like the police? The answer is no. Instead, it records what is known as an Enforcement Case Information Report, infamously known as the ECIR. Interestingly, you will not find the term ECIR anywhere in the Act. It is not an it is an administrative document maintained by the ED for commencing its investigation. It is not an FIR. This distinction became significant because several accused persons argued before the Supreme Court that since an FIR has to be supplied to the accused, an ECIR should also be supplied. The Supreme Court considered this issue in the infamous judgment, or as I used to say back in the day when I just started practicing under this act, the Bible of PMLA practitioners, Vijay Madan Lal Chaudhary versus Union of India, and held that an ECIR is an internal document of the Enforcement Directorate and is not equivalent to an FIR under the CRPC or BNSS. Consequently, there is no statutory requirement to furnish a copy of the ECIR to the accused. However, the court clarified that when a person is arrested, the arrest happens under Section 19. The grounds of arrest must be communicated to him, thereby ensuring compliance with Article 22 of the Constitution of India. Right? Now, once the ECIR is recorded, the investigation begins, much like putting together the pieces of an elaborated financial puzzle. Unlike conventional criminal investigations where eyewitnesses or forensic evidence may play a dominant role, a PMLA investigation is driven by documents. Officers examine bank account statements, company records, income tax returns, balance sheets, audit reports, shareholding patterns, emails, digital devices, and transaction histories. Every financial transaction is analyzed to understand whether it represents legitimate commercial activity or whether it is merely one link in a chain designed to disguise the origin of criminal proceeds. And this is why many lawyers describe PMLA legislation as a combination of law, finance, and forensic auditing. An advocate appearing in a PMLA matter must also often understand corporate structures and banking transactions as thoroughly as legal principles because the Act confers extensive investigative powers upon the ED. For example, under Section 50, the director or any other authorized officer under the director have the power to summon any person whose attendance they consider necessary during the investigation. Now, such person may be required to give evidence on oath or produce documents relevant to the inquiry. Now, this provision is particularly significant because proceedings under Section 50 are not deemed to be judicial proceedings for the purpose of Section 229 to 67 of BNS. You can check it out later. Consequently, a false statement during such examination may itself attract criminal consequences. Now, guys, although Section 50 proceedings are not judicial proceedings, however, non compliance under the conditions of Section 50 still may attract criminal consequences. So, the Supreme Court has consistently recognized that statements recorded under Section 50 are not recorded by police officers and therefore stand on a different legal footing from statements recorded under Section 161. Nevertheless, the questions relating to voluntariness, retraction, and evidentiary value continue to arise and are examined on the facts of each case. Another extraordinary power under the Act is the power of search and seizure. Section 17 and 18 empowers authorized officers to search premises and persons where there is reason to believe, based on material in their possession. That is very important, that ED or the officer under the ED must have some sort of material in their possession from which they believe, that there is some incriminating material against the person, that records or proceeds of crime are concealed. Unlike an ordinary police investigation, these powers are exercised within a framework specifically provided for PMLA and are accompanied by statutory safeguards. All of them are there. You just have to read the whereas, but I won't go deep dive into all the sections. But this is the major view of Section 5, 17, 18, even 9, or all the attachments. Similarly, under Section 5, the ED may provisionally attach if there is reason to believe that it constitutes proceeds of crime and are likely to be concealed or transferred or dealt with in a manner that may frustrate confiscation proceedings later on. The attachment is provisional because it is subject to confirmation by adjudicating authority under Section 8. Guys, I understand that this might sound confusing at the moment because you guys are not aware of all the judicial authorities under the PMLA, and this lecture may come as a punch on your face with all the facts and all the information that one may feel overstimulated to process in. So to simplify the entire thing, ED conducts an investigation, right? After the ED has conducted its investigation and it has material to proceed against you, it cannot directly or legally attach your properties and keep it within itself, right? There are judicial forums for it. So in a PMLA case, there are parallel proceedings that take place. One is a civil proceeding and the other one is a criminal proceeding, right? These are two parallel proceedings that take place. Civil proceeding will confer to proceeding related to the properties or the money or how a person has dealt with the proceeds of crime and how he has basically invested or has been enjoying those proceeds of crime so far. A financial trail has to be followed, has to be traced in these civil proceedings, right? These proceedings, once the ED has attached your property, it'll file a report before a PMLA adjudicating authority. That is a first authority who takes cognizance of an offense, under any offense under the PMLA, right? And thereafter, there is an appellate authority, High Court, Supreme Court, etc. Right? This is the civil route of the PMLA proceeding. Now, parallelly, a magistrate or a sessions court will have the same power to conduct the PMLA trial as a criminal trial is normally conducted. So in that criminal proceedings or the parallel criminal proceeding, the court will examine the scheduled offense and the offense of money laundering both. Just a minute. Okay, Akshara is raising her hand. Akshara, can we please take the questions after I have concluded the session? Perfect. Okay, so these are the two parallel proceedings that take place under a PMLA trial, right? A civil and a criminal. Civil go before a PMLA adjudicating authority and thereafter the PMLA appellate tribunal, and the criminal proceedings go before a magistrate or a sessions judge. Not a sessions judge, I'm sorry, a magistrate in a district court. There are special courts for these FEMA and the CBI and the PMLA. So they take care of all the criminal scheduled offense related offenses, right? So this was the overall crux of how an ED investigate uh, the matters under the PMLA. Now, let us come to perhaps the most debated aspect of the PMLA, and one of the things that client want to discuss before anything else. Why is bail under PMLA so difficult? In my experience, the first question that almost every client asks after receiving a summon or after an arrest is not whether the attachment is valid or whether the ACIR can be challenged. The first question always and always is, if I'm arrested, will I get bail and will I get out? Because unlike many other criminal statutes, the answer under the PMLA is not always straightforward. So, to appreciate why bail under the PMLA is treated differently, we must first remind ourselves of a basic principle of criminal law. One of the cornerstones of our criminal justice system is the presumption of innocence. Every accused person is presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. That is why the Supreme Court has repeatedly observed that bail is the rule and the jail is exception. Right? The rationale is simple. A criminal trial may take several years to conclude, and it would be fundamentally unfair if an individual were made to undergo prolonged incarceration before his guilt is finally established. Right? Ordinarily, while considering bail, courts examine factors such as the seriousness of the offense, the possibility of the accused fleeing from justice, influencing witnesses, tampering with evidences, or repeating the offense, right? And if these concerns can be addressed, courts generally lean in favor of granting liberty, that is bail. However, Parliament consciously adopted a different approach for offences under the PMLA. The legislature considered money laundering to be more than an ordinary financial offense. It viewed it as a crime capable of destabilizing the country's financial system, facilitating organized crime, encouraging corruption, funding narcotics trafficking, and even threatening the national security. And unlike conventional theft or assault, the consequences of money laundering, um, uh, just a minute, guys, I'm getting a call. Sorry, guys, just give me a second, please. I am so sorry, guys. We have a vacation bench sitting at the time, and the work is still in force. So, yes, I'm sorry. Huh. So I was saying, unlike a conventional crime like theft or assault, the consequences of laundering criminal proceeds extend far, far beyond the immediate victim. The money generated through criminal proceeds, may, let's say, create a situation where you have created a nexus of drug dealers, or have created a situation where you are encouraging foreign funding into the country to destabilize the condition or the peace in the country. So this is the extent or the threat that the parliament kept in mind while making bail very difficult under this act. The money generated through one offense often becomes the capital used to finance further criminal activities, in simple terms. And therefore, Parliament believed that ordinary bail principles were inadequate to deal with such offences. So this philosophy is reflected in Section 45, the infamous Section 45 of the Act, which is perhaps one of the most discussed, debated, hot topic or the hottest provisions in the entire statute. Section 45 begins with a non obstante clause, meaning that it overrides a general provisions relating to bail contained in BNSS. It introduces what are popularly known as the twin conditions for the grant of bail. Not sure how much you guys have studied PMLA in the classes so far, or how much you have read judgments, otherwise, which talks about the twin condition. But the first condition under the Section 45 requires that the public prosecutor must be given an opportunity to oppose the bail application. This requirement ensures that the investigating agency has a full opportunity to place the material collected during the investigation before the court and before the court makes any decision on the liberty taken. Second condition is what makes the provision particularly stringent. If the public prosecutor opposes the application, the court must be satisfied that there is reasonable grounds for believing that the accused is not guilty of the offense and that he's not likely to commit any offense while in bail. Think about this for a moment. At the stage of bail, the trial has not even commenced, evidence has not been fully led, witnesses have not been cross examined yet the court is required to arrive at a prima facie satisfaction regarding the accused innocence. This is a significantly higher threshold than what is ordinarily applied in criminal jurisprudence, and that is the requirement. That is this requirement that makes obtaining bail under the Act particularly challenging. And naturally, these stringent conditions were challenged thereafter before the Supreme Court. The infamous case, and one case which I recommend all of you to thoroughly read, is Nikesh Tarachand Shah versus Union of India. The judgment was authored by former Justice Mr. Nariman. Excuse me. The court struck down the twin condition in this judgment as unconstitutional, holding that that they violated Article 14 and 21 of the Constitution. The court found that the manner in which Section 45 was then drafted created an arbitrary classification and imposed unreasonable restriction on personal liberty. Right. Parliament, however, then responded swiftly. Through the Finance Act 2018, Section 45 was amended. Right. Rather than completely taking it down, the Section 45 was amended. The reference to offences punishable with imprisonment of more than 3 years under Part A of the schedule was substituted with the expression offences under this Act. This amendment fundamentally altered the legal position and attempted to cure the constitutional defects identified in Nikesh Tarachand Shah. Right? The validity of the amended provision once again came before the Supreme Court in the landmark decision of the Bible of the new piece of the PMLA practice in Vijay Madan Lal Chaudhary. So this judgment is undoubtedly one of the most important decisions under the PMLA. A 3-judge bench upheld the constitutional validity of the amended Section 45 and reaffirmed that the twin conditions continue to apply while considering bail applications under this Act. The court emphasized that money laundering is a distinct and serious economic offense under the financial integrity of the nation, and the parliament was justified in prescribing a stricter standard for granting of bail. But does this mean that bail under the PMLA is impossible? No, I don't think so. Certainly not. The provision makes bail difficult, but it does not make it unattainable. Courts continue to examine the facts of each individual case. They consider the nature of the allegations, the evidence collected by the ED, the role attributed to the accused, the stage of the investigation, and other relevant circumstances, innumerable circumstances. Right? Moreover, the proviso of Section 45 recognizes certain humanitarian exceptions as well. The twin conditions do not operate with the same rigor in the cases where a person is under the age of 16 years, a woman, a person who is sick or infirm, or where the amount involved is below the statutory threshold prescribed by the Act. Guys, your homework for today would be to to find out what is the statutory threshold prescribed under the PMLA to initiate the proceeding, right? Is it 1 rupee, 1 lakh, 1 CR, 10 CR, whatever, right? Now, these exceptions reflect Parliament's attempt to balance the need for effective enforcement with consideration of fairness and compensation, compassion. I'm sorry. Right? Now, another important aspect that young lawyers or young future lawyers should appreciate is that the bail arguments in PMLA matters are rarely confined to Section 45 alone. They often involve broader constitutional principles relating to personal liberty under Article 21, procedural fairness, the legality of arrest under Section 19, the compliance with statutory safeguards, and the quality of evidence collected during the investigation. For instance, in Pankaj Bansal versus Union of India, the Supreme Court held that the ground of arrest must be furnished in writing to the arrested person. Non-compliance with this requirement can have significant implication for the legality of the arrest itself and may become an important consideration while seeking bail. Right? Yes, I don't want to bombard you with the information in the PMLA because it's a vast legislation and 1 hour unfortunately is not enough to cover the entire scheme of the event. But now I conclude 3 main questions while answering the last one of the sessions, right? So let me leave you with one final thought. The Prevention of Money Laundering Act is often described as one of the toughest legislation in the country. But like every powerful law, it is also one of the most misunderstood legislation. As lawyers, our role is not to view it either an instrument of oppression or a weapon of enforcement. Our role is to understand it objectively, apply it correctly, and ensure that while the state effectively combats economic crime, constitutional guarantees and the rule of law, I repeat, constitutional guarantees and the rule of law are never compromised. Whenever you come across a PMLA case in future, don't begin with the questions such as, has the ED arrested the accused? Instead, ask yourself 4 simple questions. What is the scheduled offense? Where are the proceeds of crime? What is the alleged laundering activity? And has the procedure prescribed under this act has been followed? If you can answer these questions, you have already understood more than half the act, right? Now, before I end, I just want to say one thing to all of you lovely students. Don't be intimidated by legislations like the PMLA. Every lawyer you admire today was once sitting exactly where you are, wondering, why the Bear Act seemed so confusing. The difference is that they stayed curious, right? So don't study the law only to clear exams. Study it to understand how it works in the real world. Ask questions, challenge assumptions, read judgments, and never, ever, ever be afraid to say that I don't understand this act. Law is not a subject you finish learning. It's a profession in which you keep learning every single day. I still keep after 5.5 years in the practice. I still learn every new things every day. I genuinely hope a few years from now on, guys, when some of you are arguing your first PMLA matter, hopefully against me, you'll remember that it all began with one simple 1 hour lecture, right? Thanks a lot, guys. I end my session, my gyan for this evening, and the floor is yours. Whoever want to ask the question, please feel free to do so.
Thank you, ma'am, for such an incredible, insightful session.
And I'm so sorry, guys. I'm so sorry, Ananya, to cut you off in between. I had to take an urgent call because the courts are still ongoing, and that's why I had to mute myself in between. I hope that did not cause any, interruption during the flow of the lecture.
That's okay. Before taking out the questions from the chat box, we have already gathered questions from the students. So we'll quickly go through those and take up the few questions from chat box in the meantime.
I'll just see it.
Firstly, what are the most common mistakes young lawyers make while handling financial?
can I select the questions from the chat box?
Yes, you
Because
may
I
also do
believe
that.
some of the questions which are there in the chat box have already been covered
Okay.
in the lecture. So, in rather to avoid the repeating myself and for the sake of brevity, I'll just take the question
You
which
may do
may
that.
be slightly newer, on a newer side. Hmm. Give me a moment, guys. I'm not a very tech savvy person. Okay, so Mohammed Saleh Rasi asked, do you think the investigation and attachment parts of the ED are sufficiently balanced by judicial safeguards, or is there still a risk of excessive executive discretion? Okay, so again, so this is not something which I can give a lecture on. This is purely and purely my opinion on the subject matter. As a practitioner, I believe that the attachment powers, be it attachment powers or the arrest of a person by ED under the be it under the statute or through the judgments, are slightly wider and unfairly wider, I would say. Right? For example, the first information you get, that as an accused that you have been incriminated in a crime, is through an FIR. Right? An FIR is a document which entails all the allegations against you, based on which you understand why you are being, let's say, being arrested by the police. ECIR, on the other hand, let's say, I won't talk about attachment pass, Saleh, because I'm just giving you the similar example, but it answers your questions well, right? So ECIR is, let's say, is an internal document which ED is not necessarily obligated to provide you even at the time of arrest. At the time of arrest, they may tell you that we are arresting you on so and so grounds, and that basically they are finished with their obligations thereafter. And when you seek bail, let's say a 1 month or 2 month period had already been extinguished, and you are already in jail without knowing what are the allegations against you. In similar way, when an ED knocks your door, seeking attachment, not attachment at the time, but searching or seizuring XYZ property, you are not told at the moment that these are the allegations against you, and that is why we are doing search and seizure at your property. Like, they simply tell you that they have registered or they have gotten an information for a potential money laundering that has been committed by you, and that is why here's the panchnama, and we would be searching your property and seizing whatever incriminating material we feel is on the property. Now, it could be FDs, it could be your mobile devices, it could be your documents, it could be anything in the house that may give an idea or the impression to the ED that this is related to money laundering. Right now, at this point, this in this particular situation, there is no particular safeguard to the person or the accused in the question. The accused is absolutely unaware as to what gave ED an idea that I committed an offense under Section 3 of the Act, right? So, this is one broad but a very small example that why I personally feel that ED powers under the Act, though very much supported and backed by the judicial precedents, is unfairly wider. And yes, I hope that answer your question of whether there is still a risk of excessive executive discretion. Okay, I am searching the next question. Um, okay, so there is an interesting question. How does a schedule offense affects proceedings under PMLA? First, PMLA proceedings cannot take place. This is by Farhan Mohammed. PMLA proceedings cannot take place until unless there is a scheduled offense present in the allegations against you, right? It, but at the same time, I also gave you an example that a party who is not necessarily involved in the scheduled offense can also be part or party to the PMLA proceedings, right? But in any case, in both these situations, presence of the scheduled offense, so at least one person is very much important. So that is the major and the significant difference, and that is how a presence of a scheduled offense indicates that what exactly have you done. For example, if you have committed fraud, let's say a fraud is a scheduled offense, and now fraud by, let's say from banks, right? You have taken money, and usually when people take money from bank, it's usually in access, right? 100 cr, 10 cr, 20 cr, whatever. So one would naturally be assuming that a person who is taking a loan or whatever transaction from of this amount from the bank may divert those funds through a shell company, or to, let's say, buy another property to convert or paint those illegitimate funds from the bank, right, into a white proceedings, right? And at the same time, that person's CA, who is well aware how to basically route that money into a shell money, is aware that this is the process that you have to go through. These are the provisions under, let's say, taxation law that can give you an umbrella or a justification to route your fund through this process sorry, from your country to another country. So, in this sort of situation, both of them are committing the act of money laundering. One who is directly related to the scheduled offense, the person who has taken loan from the bank, let's say, who has committed first fraud and then has tainted this money into a white money. And the second is the person who has actively supported this person into committing money laundering process, right? So that is how a scheduled offense would affect the proceedings under the PML. Okay, guys, let's rest all. I believe the questions have already covered. Okay, I think I've already covered the remaining questions, which I see. Ananya, I think I handed over to you. These are two major questions I felt needed answering. Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. Apart from these, a few questions have been asked by the students itself. So we'll take a few questions if.
Okay. So I see one more question section. Sakhawat Ali. Section 24 of the PMLA reverses the burden of proof onto the accused. From a defense perspective, what is the most effective strategy to discharge this burden during trial? Again, trace the money trail. That's all. Go through all the documents that the business or a person may have in their possession. Could be their balance sheets, ITR, transactional proofs, invoices, digital evidence, emails, everything under the umbrella. Just trace the money, understand what are the allegations against you. Let's say ED says that you have generated an FD of 150 CR through illegal mining. Right now, in this situation, one, I will see from where all I have gotten the money in the bank accounts where I have the FD submitted, right? So I'll trace those money to the very origin from where I'm getting money. Let's say it could be through my another business where I sell garments. By selling of those garments, I made some money. I transferred those into the FD account, and that is the origin, or that is the traceable route of the alleged proceeds in that case. So the most effective strategy is always, wherever there is an allegation against you, trace the money trace the money related to that allegation. Show the court that whatever the ED has claiming that I have obtained through tainting the black money or the illegitimate money, there is a clear traceable path of that money, and that path is entirely or absolutely legitimate and contains zero or absolute no shadow of money laundering. What if enforcement agencies are also engages in these scheduled offenses under PMLA? No comments on that. Which landmark judgments have the greatest impact on anti-money laundering laws? Uh, Tarashancha, Vijay Madanlal, Pankaj Bansal. I've mentioned all three judgments to understand the basics of the statute. Go through these three judgments; they are absolute gem for anybody to understand how the entire scheme of provision or the law actually works under the statute. Is any online platform where this type of information present or available? There's Bear Act. Azhar Ahmed, there's Bear Act and judgments. Okay, and lastly, I see Shivraj asks, where can I learn more about PMLA more deeply? Through precedents. I think that's the most questions I can take for this evening. I'll preserve the remaining of my energy for the judge to ask me.
Thank you, ma'am, for such an enlightening session. As we come to the close of this enriching session, it is my privilege, on behalf of law jurists, to propose the formal vote of thanks. We express our deepest gratitude to Ms. Shachi Kotari for sharing
Shachi.
her
I'm so sorry, it's Shachi.
Shashi Kudari, ma'am, for sharing her invaluable time, expertise, and all those insights, practical insights of courtroom with us today. You have given us a masterclass on operational realities of PMLA and advocacy that goes far beyond traditional trade textbooks. A sincere thanks to also goes to Mr. Ayush Gaurav and the entire law jurist team for organizing this impactful session, and to our active audience for their brilliant engagement. Thank you all for your presence. Have a wonderful evening ahead, and we look forward to welcoming you to our future sessions. Thank you, ma'am.
All right. Thanks a lot, guys. Have a wonderful evening and a wonderful weekend ahead. Bye.